A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes and entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. That point is something new. We have begun our discussions on Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So we are going through chapter 3. So from the prologue to up until chapter 4 is what we're talking about. So if you haven't read through that, catch up and we'll see you on the flip side.
Hey there, this is Cross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
Dude, I'm so fucking excited. Like, this is such a fun, fresh take on, like, this show. It's just a reset, and I loved the way we did the show before, and we're kind of keeping the same, like, format, but just having a new book in front of me is super, super, super exciting. So I hope that comes through in this episode. I think it will, because I'm going to be gushing about it quite a bit, I think.
It's really cool. Like, I am very excited. This is before we're like going to really get into talking about this whole lot, but we obviously covered the entirety of the Red Rising series published so far before, and now like jumping into this new universe. It is so fun to now have like reset expectations and starting this new world, and I'm very excited for what's to come.
Yeah.
And
I was nervous. I was really nervous to do this.
Fuck yeah. Fuck yeah. I'm super nervous. It's fine. I'm actually not super nervous right now, but I am still a little sick, so it might sound a little offy for new listeners or anything like that. I'm not generally this congested, but right now I'm on the back end of a virus. So not COVID, thankfully, but as it were.
He wants you to believe that. He's the COVID epicenter right now.
Jesus Christ. Okay, so today we are discussing Mistborn, The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, and we are going to chat about chapters prologue through 3, or up until 4, as you said. Keep in mind, one of the things, just on a front-end note, we are, because of the way the audiobook does it, we are going to always end these episodes with whatever the final the journal entry above the next chapter is. So, for instance, this week we are ending on the chapter 4 journal entry. That's because of the way the audiobook does it, because we both listened to the audiobook read by Michael Kramer, as well as we obviously read the book. Yeah. So we're kind of dealing with a mixed medium. We're going to just do that. It's easy enough to just read that next little section at the top of those chapter headings. So
just a little nugget right before you finish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, little something to tease next week. It's perfect. It's such a good way to end each thing, because it's a cliffhanger naturally in its own right. So
a little palate cleanser.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. So before we talk about the book, first let's talk about what we're drinking. PJ, what are you having today?
I have made myself an Elderflower Gin Cocktail. I was trying to make a fun, like, thematic name for it, but couldn't think of one, and didn't have that much time to think about it between making it and sitting down here. So it is 1.5 ounces of gin. I'm using the barrel rested gin that you got me, the End of Days gin.
Yes.
It's so fucking good.
It's the best gin on the planet.
3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice, 1/2 ounce of maraschino liqueur, 1/2 ounce of elderflower liqueur, and an egg white, all shaken and garnished with a lemon peel and a cocktail cherry. It's super, super nice, delicate, a little bit sweet, but refreshing, and I'm really excited about it. I don't know if I would actually change anything in a subsequent make. Maybe like one dash of bitters, maybe. But I don't know if it even needs that. It's not super well balanced. It's sweet and a little bit tart, but I really like it, so I'm gonna keep it as it is in my recipe book.
Keep drinking it the way that it is. That's nice. Mm-hmm. That sounds really good. Sounds great. Sounds refreshing.
Yeah. And usually I would be following this up with a beer to sip on, because we tend to take a little bit of time to go through notes and stuff, so I drink like half the cocktail before we actually start recording. The reason, or the way we're doing the recording this week, it's super front loaded because we've got a lot going on, which means I also have to cram all of my homework and studying and shit into the time that we've got. So I am just drinking water with lemon juice after this, and that way I can not be too fucked up when I start working on homework and projects after this. So that's what I've got next.
Super reasonable. Not that we're fucked up at the end of every episode, but yeah, I mean, given that it's your finals week, leading into your like finals 2 weeks, I should say, it's definitely, good. You want to keep that time productive. So totally understood.
But what have you got?
I am having a drink that was originally recommended by one of our patrons, Tim Pearson, and our good friend. He recommended a drink that was called the Allomancer with a little bit of Googling. That drink is generally 3/4 ounces of Campari, 3/4 ounces orange liqueur, 1/2 ounce orange juice, 3 ounces of blood orange brighter tonic. You can sub in a orange kombucha in a pinch if you can't find the brighter tonic. However, I was unable to find that and didn't have the substitute ready to go, so I altered it just a little bit. So what I'm calling this drink, instead of the Allomancer, is the Survivor of Hath Sin, named after the part of the book, named after, in addition to Kelsier. And so what it is it is 45 milliliters of Campari, 1.5 ounces, 45 milliliters triple sec, 60 milliliters of orange juice, 3 dashes of orange bitters, and Mum Prosecco to top at 6 ounces, or, God, what is that? 30 milliliters times 6, brain, 1800 milliliters? 180 milliliters, fucking brain, of Prosecco on top. So that is the cocktail, the Survivor of Hath Sin, and it is really fucking tasty. I'm not going to lie. I also took a photo of it, and I realized after I took the photo, staring at the books that I put behind them, they're in the wrong order. I have it ordered Well of Ascension, The Hero of Ages, and The Final Empire.
Good. There we go.
Silly. But yeah, pretty funny. You can
That's
call
a
that
lot of Prosecco, man.
Well, it's
to add
so
to
I
the top
doubled
of
the
that.
rest of the cocktail.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So I doubled the cocktail, basically.
There you
Because
go.
generally the cocktail would be this halved. So generally it'd be a 3 ounce. Because generally it's a 3 ounce pour of the brighter tonic, right? Yeah, so this would be like less of a like coupe glass cocktail and more of like I kind of did it in like a mid-ball glass. So that'll be on the website. By the way, you can always check out our cocktails on our website, wordsandwhiskey.show/drinks. And you can check out the pictures that we take, as well as soon some videos of us building some cocktails, not all of them.
And that doesn't, the pictures, mainly, you get the pictures because they're fun to look at, but you do get the full recipes and everything. And they're searchable by, what are our tags? Our tags are the cocktail, or not the spirits that are used, as well as the episode that they appear on for the most part.
Yep. And the book.
Okay. And the book.
Yeah. Yep.
Right, we have
so like
more
you can
books
click
now.
the Mistborn Final Empire tag and see all the drinks we had for the book. So pretty cool.
Yeah, Tim does a good job of making our website really cool and fun to use. So
really
Tim.
cool. Yes, for sure. Beyond that, my follow-up, because I don't have to be as productive after this, PJ. I'm not going to school in addition to trying to run a podcast and do a bunch of shit in 1 week.
And work full-time.
It's true. I do work full-time. I mean,
yeah, but barely. Like, what do you do?
Oh
you
my
like
God.
Call people and, I don't know,
I hate you.
talk.
I hate you.
Obviously, you work hard. I know you work hard. You have a stressful job, and both of us use this as kind of our escape, which is great.
And hangout time and whatnot.
Yeah.
I have here a sidecar of mimosa to follow this up, because I bought 2 full bottles of Mum because they were on sale. We had one, or I had one rather, for the Chernobyl episodes, and nursed for the rest of the day. I didn't finish it in the episode. And then I've got this, which will last more than more than this episode. So that's kind of the game plan. Yeah.
You are taking so far after your stepmom for that.
Yes.
I remember going for her to the store to pick up like a case of, I think it was Mum.
It's Mum. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it was like, it's half off. Like, just go get me a case of it. I'm like,
right.
Okay,
normally
cool.
like $29 a bottle. I got 3 bottles for $17. This is great.
17 total?
Here we are. 17 apiece.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to say, what the
great.
fuck?
I mean, it's still great. Yeah.
Send some this way.
It's still a great deal.
Mum's great, though. Like,
yeah.
That's a good, it's Prosecco, not champagne, correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's all champagne. It's just not from the Champagne region.
Yeah, but that's blah, blah, blah. Pretentious
Same
wine
grace.
shit, and who gives a shit?
Right. Mm-hmm. We generally have a beer to follow up, but this week we don't. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm probably going to end up opening something. Like, just knowing me.
This is going to go on a long time. I'm like, I feel like you're going to want a beer at hour 2.
Yeah.
But...
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just predicting how long this is going to go. Generally here, we would also have last week's predictions. However, there are no predictions going into this. With that, on the frontier, what we want to say is that send in any questions that you might want PJ to answer. They can be kind of leading. I will kind of suss them out, figure out where they belong. If you want to ask any questions of PJ and his opinions on things, leave them here. We'll talk about them episode to episode until they're answered. Send them into us either on Instagram, Twitter, or Gmail. wordsandwhiskey@gmail.com. Wordswhiskeypod on Instagram and wordswhiskeypod. Fuck.
And whiskey is with an E because we're American. So
correct. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's how we spell
show
it.
those biases often. Just want to make sure that we know and you guys know that you can send in those predictions. So with that, any other thoughts? Anything else that you want to talk about before we get into this very fun breakdown?
Nope. I don't have anything else. Let's fucking get into it.
Cool. Time to talk about Brandon Sanderson. So with that, let's get into our thoughts. We start off here with the prologue. Right off the bat, we begin with a unique piece of italicized text, one that follows us through this week's reading, talking about how this specific narrator within these statements is a prophesied hero of ages. What do you make of this prophecy that we get right at the beginning and this title, The Hero of Ages?
Just these sort of journal entries in general, I'm kind of going to talk about a little bit. I don't know how unique they are. That's the other thing. For any new listeners here, I am not a reader.
Holy shit. How did we not I mean, we did in episode 0, so that makes sense.
I guess we kind of did, yeah. But I don't do a lot of reading, and that was our catalyst for starting the show, was I want to do more reading. Crossland has all these stories that he loves and wants me to experience with him. And this is kind of the way to force me to do that, by starting a fucking company and making me read.
Right.
So we
have a tax ID and everything. It's great.
We do. I'm not going to say it out loud because I don't remember it off the top of my head, and maybe we shouldn't share that. But we do have one.
Numbers.
I don't know if it's public information. You might be able to
I don't know.
it up.
I don't think it is, because it's treated kind of like a social security.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, with that in mind, I have no idea what like typical novel tropes are, or like what's cliched and what's not. All I know is what I've experienced and what I find unique. And this feels unique to me, is this sort of flash forward journal entry kind of style. And I'm sure it exists, and I'm sure it exists elsewhere. But it felt super like cool and satisfying, and it gives us enough context to really understand the gravity of what we're dealing with without actually giving away very much information. And it's really intriguing and makes me that much more immersed into this story and into this universe. And holy shit, did this grip me. Like, I think more than anything, these journal entries are what make me truly love this like first chunk of book that we've gotten into, and I'm gung-ho about it, so I'm excited.
That's great, man. I can't agree with you more. My experience with this novel, I should say, is one that's actually relatively fresh as well. That we put up months ago, back in June or July, we put up a poll between Patreon and openly on Twitter and Instagram for people to vote on the next book series that we would cover after Red Rising, so that I could have enough time to potentially read something that I hadn't read before. I hadn't read Brandon Sanderson. It won. We talked about this a little bit in episode 0. And so these sections were also what like got its latches in me right off the bat. And then the characters, of course, as we start to understand them, really become, you know, obviously leading driving factors. But we basically have like 2 different narratives at this point kind of running parallel, which is interesting. And one is like just bite-sized like tweets basically from like some guy's diary, and the other one is like this full-fledged story that we're getting all these emotions and perspectives on. And I totally agree with you. I absolutely love this. I think that it is brilliant, and like you said, kind of that this flash forward device is excellent. But I will also say that this is fairly unique. I cannot think of a story immediately that uses a narrative device quite like this, quite so effectively, so consistently. Like, this is every chapter so far, you know? Like, right. It's consistent, it seems. So,
which is awesome. And yeah, like I said, satisfying. Look at me, I just finished the fucking drink.
Jesus
We're on
Christ.
the first question.
What did you have any thoughts specifically about the Hero of Ages, what it could be, you know, kind of components directly to the story, less the meta narrative, more the immediate narrative?
Well, it is a grand title, and it doesn't really give away anything beyond that. Like, it is a very encompassing, like, the Hero of Ages is basically, to me, that means it is the hero that kind of transcends immediacy. Like, this is what we've been waiting for, and we get a lot of prophecy stuff later in these journal entries. Like, this is the prophecy says this is what I am, but it is something transcendental in that sort of respect. So I don't know. I just know it's big. It's important, and it doesn't really give you anything beyond that. Yeah. It's so interesting and fascinating. I totally agree with you. Love it. So we cut from the prophecy to ash falling from the sky. It's treated so normally by the first character that we're introduced to here, Lord Trusting, that it comes off rather simply and sets this kind of like larger than life scene that we see from the perspective of one of these Lord noblemen. What do you think about Lord Trusting and kind of the way that this is used as our first setting of the world? Well, as far as setting goes, with the ash falling from the sky, we do get a little bit of explanation and a little bit of exposition in that sense that this isn't uncommon and is more of just kind of an annoyance. God, would that suck, huh? Fuck. But if you have to deal with it every day, I guess technologies and kind of the way you go about your life is based around it. So, like, people in the Pacific Northwest dealing with rain every fucking day. It sucks, and nobody should have to do that, but they do, and apparently they are fine with it. But Lord Trusting is pretty calloused and just kind of a piece of shit. He doesn't seem that important. And we get more information. He's kind of bordering on countryside, not necessarily rural, but like not city folk to a certain extent. Right. He's trying to earn his way to be a city folk. Yeah. But he's so, and this is just basically the stand-in, as far as I can tell, for the typical way that nobles think about the sky in general. And like, no, they're pieces of shit property to be beaten at will and a means to an end for production, and they don't care. So I think Lord Trusting in general is less of a villain and less of a character to be pondered very closely, and more of just kind of the introduction to the noble class in general. And fuck those guys. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely correct, as we learn later, that literally Kelsier murders him, and we'll talk about that later. But
it's very interesting. We get a ton of terminology thrown at us right off the bat here, right? We get Ska, we get Obligators, we get Luthadel, the capital city, we get the Lord Ruler, Mistborns, Mistings, Ashmounts, this Red Sun, as well as kind of the Ska is like general fear of the mist itself. There's so much world building in so little time, and it is densely packed, critically delivered. One little nugget of information here too, to kind of go into what you were saying, is these Ska are on loan from the Lord Ruler themselves. So there's also that aspect of like they are property, but they're on loan from the Lord Ruler. Mm-hmm. You know, like so they're not necessarily the Lord Trusting's property. They're the Lord Ruler's property. Fascinating. Well,
okay, so if you lease a car,
right,
would you consider it your property for the sake of like theft and stuff like that?
It's not considered. So here's the thing. Theft, you're responsible for it, I think, in the end, any costs and things like that. But I don't think you can list it on like credit applications for things as an asset that you own.
Okay.
If it's leased, it's not an asset. So
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking Ska as cars, apparently.
Well, I mean, reasonable thing though, to like try to distinguish property lines and things like that exist. So I don't. Yeah.
I mean, you shouldn't do that with people, but, you know, they do, so we have to discuss it.
Agreed. We're trying to...
We are starkly anti-slavery here on this podcast. We're going to take that hot take and be on the side of the people. We are
this flaming
against slavery.
Yeah.
So one thing I do want to point out here, and we've talked about not bringing up Red Rising much because we don't want to spoil anything if anybody hasn't read that yet. But I will say, just from the way that we tackle this and this episode in general and me like reading through it, Brandon Sanderson is an accomplished writer by the time he writes this, correct?
He's already published one book.
Just
this
one.
Is his second novel.
Okay. It feels so much more...
He's written 8 at this point.
Okay. Well, in that respect, like I can tell there is more polish here than there is at the beginning of Red Rising. Yeah. And like you can tell that this is a much more experienced novelist. And with that in mind, I feel like this was super well done. And I feel like I'm going to be saying that a lot throughout this because it is perfectly balanced between not telling us, like not being too heavy-handed, like telling us enough for what we need to know in order to like understand what's going on in the world. It's a bit blunt at times when discussing things, but it kind of has to be because they're new terms and they're terms that only exist within this universe. And without explanation, like, we couldn't understand what was happening. A lot is left to subtext or future reveal, and it just builds this satisfaction of uncovering what is meant in these like beginning sentences of this book. And it just, with that, created this wonderful immersion into this world. In like, it's like walking into a hot tub, just really clean and smooth and just sinking into it in such a clean way. I don't know the best way to describe that, but
and that's your thoughts on the world building in general. Yeah. Any terms that you like or have questions about or anything like that? I won't answer beyond what we know, but you know, like anything that's perking your interest right now.
Ska in general, where that term came from and why it's a different term than just peasants, which he refers to them as peasants. When like the first time Ska is used, it refers to it as the peasant class or whatever the exact term that they use to describe it is. And I'm curious why either slaves or peasants aren't used in place, if there's a reason for that, or if it's just to distinguish this work from others.
Any others? That's a great one. I love that. That's a great question to have at this point.
As far as terms go, I don't think so. I think that's the main one. Like, I'm sure the Red Sun, it seems like... So the Red Sun seems to be kind of in conjunction with the fact that ash falls down constantly, like just ash being in the atmosphere creates a sort of a smog, which will naturally create more diffusion of sunlight. So the sun probably looks more red, but it could also just be a different type of star that is more red focused. Like the light and the photons that it's giving off are more in the red spectrum. That's interesting. There's a whole lot of just, was it Obligator or which was the character that Lord Tristan? I believe
Trusting is talking to an Obligator. Yes.
Obligator. Yep. So that is something that
we meet 3 different Obligators over the course.
We do, but we don't know anything about what they actually do as far as like why they're called Obligators.
Right. Yep.
Like where that term came from. So that's an interesting one. Lord Ruler, he's, or she, they, is referred to almost as a god and explicitly as a god at one point. Immortal and imbued allomancy, like, abilities onto the initial followers. So, like, that's fucking crazy. But terminology-wise, I feel like that's most of it.
Cool. All right. Just wanted to check, make sure if there's any clarity that can be had on the front end. Want to make sure that, Brandon Sanderson does a wonderful job delivering all of this. So it's not necessary that I would go through and do that. I think it's one of his best talents is being a clarifying force inside of his own story, which is great and important in a new world like this. So, we, of course, leave Trusting's perspective as he's discussing with the obligator. Jesus Christ. The obligator, he's having this conversation with the obligator. He leaves that conversation kind of satisfied and going to potentially go sleep with a ska woman, of whom will later have to be killed, of which we're also informed from the obligator, to Kelsier's perspective. Yeah, the so-called survivor of Hath Sin. What do you think of Kelsier?
Well, he's clearly got a pretty strong personality. He's charismatic, intelligent, calculated, a little bit brash at times. He is a presence in the room. Like, he's smiling when nobody fucking smiles. Like, he is there and everybody knows it. And throughout, like, he's also caring. He is kind of a force of chaos, but he's caring. All of that combined make me constantly just wish to be in his head, wish to follow him around no matter what. And I know, like, there's a whole lot to be gained by being in other perspectives, but I don't want to anytime it ends, because I just want more of him. But that's not to say that any of the other perspectives, and I do want to discuss perspectives in a second, but if we're sticking with that sort of term, they're all great and they're all unique and fun, but his seems so much fun that I just want more of it. Anyway, as far as perspective goes, I appreciate how the perspective change, and I really appreciate how fluidly they change, especially in the audiobook. I know there's quite a bit of a break within the text, so you know that they're switching perspectives, but in the audiobook, you almost don't need that break. It just fluidly transfers to the new character without any sort of jarring effect in, like, understanding what's going on. And that's super, super cool.
Yeah, to that point, real quick, just Michael Kramer does a fantastic job of, like, giving a little bit of whatever the accent is of the perspective that you're in, so that you kind of get an idea. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I'm trying to figure out and articulate a better term than perspective, because it feels more omniscient than that. And, like, we're not in their heads. We are. We do know what they're thinking and feeling, but we also get more information than the character does, and that, like, at certain points. So I know there are a lot of different perspectives that can, like, points of view that can be written from, but I don't quite know the nuance of what is considered a perspective and what is not? Like, is there a delineation between point of view and perspective, and how that all works? Do you have any kind of clarity for that?
Yeah. To like lend some clarity, I think here, I think about this. This story is a third-person limited perspective. However, unlike a lot of other narratives, it does change, so we actually do get a sense of dramatic irony. A lot of the time people will call like third-person limited like just inside of one head. However, that makes it difficult to describe when you might flip perspectives with enough of a break within a different scene to a different character, so it still feels like it's limited third person and not omniscient. Omniscient would give us, or maybe we're limited omniscient. Like there's also that potential. But generally, an omniscient perspective would be one that would present both sides and kind of react to them on the outset, and maybe their inner thoughts without head flipping between the two, which is a big problem when you're thinking about writing a limited or an omniscient perspective. So this to me feels like I would most closely describe it as third person limited with multiple point of views. We've got a point of view inside of the journal. We've got a point of view inside of Kelsier. We've got a point of view inside of Trusting. We've got a point of view inside of Vin so far. Right. Not to say that there couldn't be more or less, but those are kind of the things. It's not as strict of a point of view break as a number of other novels are. So, okay. But it does feel like it's point of view limited.
Okay.
Because we don't... Right now, we still don't know everything about Alamancy, right? An omniscient perspective wouldn't hide details like that necessarily. It could, okay, but when they're presented, it wouldn't. If that makes sense. If something were to happen on screen, it would describe it as though it knew exactly what was happening. So that's maybe my best example.
Super limiting as far as how to actually write a story then.
Omniscient?
Yeah. Like fully omniscient.
Very difficult.
Okay.
It is not uncommon though, because it's great for like traditional like reality this sounds so strange, but to say like a traditional human story to some degree, like To Kill a Mockingbird, would be that's not an omniscient story, but something that's more grounded in reality where you don't need to explain so much because there's some assumed knowledge.
Do you have better? Just off the top of your head, do you have an example of an omniscient story that I could like look at, or maybe have read in like high school or something like that?
So most Ernest Hemingway, not all, but most Ernest Hemingway is omniscient. Okay. So I've got an example here written by someone on Medium. They did a great job explaining the difference, right? So a third person limited perspective would read like this. What are you doing? He knew he shouldn't have asked. She looked at him and he'd lost his mind. Anger vibrated in her bones. What do you think I'm doing? She hated the way he acted, like she was doing something wrong all the damn time. She wanted to lash out, kick him in the balls, something to wipe that look off of his face. I think you're doing something stupid again. So the attribution is carried from the primary character's perspective. We can understand that she's saying one thing versus the other character because we don't really get internal monologue from the other. We don't get any internal monologue from the other character. The same scene from an omniscient perspective would be, what are you doing? He must have lost his mind. Anger vibrated in her bones. What do you think I'm doing? They both tightened their fists at their side, each of them holding back from lashing out physically. She wanted to kick him in the balls. He wanted to put her over his knee. I think you're going to do something stupid again. Okay. Does that make sense? So you get the multiple things you get the multiple perspectives at the same time. You get the varied pronouns. You get, kind of the amalgamation of thoughts within even the same paragraph, which is a big deal. Gotcha. That makes sense. It commonly referred to as like head flipping to some degree, but there's a long-winded explanation. These are, I think it's the best way that I would describe it is limited point of view, third person. If you guys have feedback, listeners, let us know, but that seems to be the most reasonable explanation that I can find. Cool. What do you... Where are we at? What do you think of the conversation with Scott Tepper and Menace, the general demeanor of the populace on Trusting's land? It's fucking depressing, man. Yeah. Like, the Ska live such dreary lives, which obviously create dreary people. Going, I guess, forward a little bit, they kind of seem to lack any sort of optimism in their lives in general, and don't do anything fun, even after work.
like within their homes, they just sit around and eat bland soup and go to bed.
Yeah.
That is to say, I guess, that the world isn't fully devoid of hope for these people. Like, there are clearly regularly, maybe not commonly, but there are travelers that come through and give sort of tales of what's going on elsewhere, which we learn is why they let people in general. Kelsier specifically. God, their lives suck. It's so bad.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously they're slaves, so yeah, I would imagine they probably do suck, and nobody should really expect otherwise. But man, there's no cultural no spark of internal culture even at home.
Identity. Yeah, they're very lacking of identity.
Yeah, that's the best way to put it, I think.
Yeah. Culture, identity, I think it goes hand in hand.
But as far as I don't remember where I was going. Yeah, let's just leave it there.
Sure.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely something very, very interesting here going on with the ska, right? And sort of the demeanor of the populace, and it does suck. We also know that this is referred to as the final empire, which is also has this like tinge of dourness to it, of like the revolution has already came and passed in some degree, or like this is the final manifestation of, something, and that's really interesting. So
it doesn't necessarily have to invoke that thought, though. Like this.
But it implies it.
Well, what about Star Trek? The final frontier, space.
Yeah, thinking about constrained within the narrative, right?
Yeah.
Constrained within the narrative, what people understand is this to be the final. I agree with you. I understand. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the theme and the feeling that comes along with the story entirely and from the outset is one of dreariness.
Yeah.
So
dreary, dour, ash, black skies, red sun, very, very interesting kind of visuals. There's here.
Literally ash falling from the sky on a regular basis.
Right.
It doesn't get more suckish than that.
Mm-hmm. Of course, we've talked, I've mentioned at the very least Kelsier. Kelsier then burns tin as he's having this discussion with Tepper and Menace, and his senses leap out of him, becoming these extrasensory things and adding depth and understanding to the picture in his mind as he does. Just this like increasing brightness and all these other things. And it's our first official introduction to Allomancy, this world's unique magic system. What do you think of Allomancy and this little scene here?
Dude, I fucking loved it. Like, this is a physical representation of magical ability. Like, it's a source that can be tapped into and interacted with and reviewed to a certain extent. It's like, as far as I can tell and as far as I understand, it's basically the mana of this world is the sort of, it's abstract and it's within their minds, kind of reaching out and touching and feeling this source. It's not it's not infinite. It is a finite source, and they can tell how much is left in it, and it just roots it in physicality. And I can't get over how much I like the way that's described.
Isn't it so fucking cool? Like, It is so cool. Yeah, no doubt. I love the way that this is depicted. And like you said, that physical reservoir, I think, is such an interesting thing for a magic system to really ground itself. We had a little bit of a discussion in our episode 0 about hard and soft magic systems. Now, do you kind of get the understanding of like a hard magic system is like very grounded and explained?
Yeah.
Because this is like you get a read on like a number or like a thing that could be done versus soft magic systems like Lord of the Rings, it's like, well, Gandalf, we know what Gandalf can do in general, but we don't know how he does it. Like,
yeah,
we've no concept of where it comes from really, or how it's measured. And this is like measurable in an interesting way.
Mm-hmm.
So want to bring that up now that we've actually experienced it to talk about it a little bit. So there, of course, is also a comment here about how the noblemen killed the Ska after they sleep with them because the Lord Ruler doesn't want half-breeds with potential powers rolling around. It's a small thing we talked about a little bit earlier, but any thoughts that you wanted to
add? So I didn't feel like it was out of place, and it felt kind of par for the course for what we already understood about the noble class. But we get more information later about why, and the existence of the mistings and that half-breeds and all that kind of that situation, and the Lord Ruler and how all that all connects. But it's a great stepping stone in the world building sort of staircase that we're building throughout this entire first section of the book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's as though there's just so much to exposit about this world that it just keeps kind of like rolling out, and you're like, oh, give me more. Oh, keep drip. It's like a drip feed, right? Like you've got a little IV bag attached to your arm, and you're like get slapping your arm, trying to like, come on, give me a little bit more. And it's it's totally like that. Yeah, I definitely love this kind of feeling, and kind of the slow drip of this information is it's so good. It's so good. So we cut from there, Menace's perspective, to that of the smoking ruins. We cut from Kelsier's perspective to that of Menace's, as Kelsier had left the night before after hearing some of the screams of Jess, of whom was taken by the Lord Ruler, or not the Lord Ruler, Lord Trusting, to be sexually assaulted, straight up. We do say on the front of this is a adult podcast. There are a lot of adult things that happen inside of this novel. It's not clean by any means. I mean, even in this first section here, we can tell that this is a semi-violent, pushes a lot of boundaries, I think, in a lot of ways, but also opens up some really good discussions around these kind of things. So she is to be taken, sexually assaulted, and Jess returns in the middle of the night from Lord Trusting's mansion, pounding on the door, her family swearing that they've proven that she isn't a Mistwraith. Menace, of course, wakes up and looks and finds the smoldering ruins of Lord Trusting's mansion. And after listening to Jess's firsthand recount of Kelsier killing everyone inside before burning the place down, it's just so fascinating. They decide that they're going to head east to where they know the Ska Rebellion is. What do you think? There's a lot that I just
there's
threw out
there's
there,
a lot there.
Yeah.
As far as their decision to head east, that's kind of out of necessity, right? Like,
yeah,
it's mentioned. Yeah, they're forced into this rebellion, and as far as I can tell, many of them didn't want to be a part of it. They probably weren't happy to be enslaved and working in this like fucking awful field, but at least they're not being hunted, and they have homes to sleep in that protect them from this mysterious mist that they're all terrified of. They're very cautious people in general, and superstitious, and I think it's important to note that they are only going to join the Ska Rebellion in the East because it's their only option of like survival. So, and at that, they don't necessarily believe that they're going to survive the journey there because of the mist, because they're going to have to sleep out in the open. I felt like that was a cool conflict of decision making that made this feel a lot more deep. So,
I love that you felt that way. And I don't want to there's no part of me that is going to downplay that. What do you think about the burning ruins, though, so there's the indecision, or the lack of choice on the part of Menace and the Ska that are there. The smoking ruins, though, imply like a lot of things on the part of Kelsier. What'd you make of that?
So, I mean, I imagined a fairly large, like, building.
Yeah.
I didn't expect it to just be fucking gone overnight. Like, without anybody noticing and waking up to it, you know? Like, so something happened to really accelerate the rate at which this burned and was just turned to rubble. Or I'm, like, not quite grasping the scale or layout of this area. Either way, fucking awesome. Fuck that guy. Glad he's dead.
Yeah, I mean, Lord Trusting definitely deserved it, right? Like, there's no doubt in my mind that the dude deserved to die. But it is something else to see this being the revelation of power as we understand it. We get like we get more drippings again, that IV bag of mythology and information and world building here over the course of the story. But we're still curious about like how exactly that could have gone down.
Of course. Always,
which makes this a fantastic prologue. I'm so picky about prologues, and this is one of the best, I think. Straight up. So,
absolutely.
So from here, we are going to move into part 1, The Survivor of Hat's Sin, to talk about these chapters.
So before we get into chapter 1, I did make a decision. Maybe a good one, maybe a bad one. I'm not sure entirely, but I finished my cocktail early, and we're taking a long time going through the prologue, so I figured we'll be here for a little bit. So I opened up a 2021 Goose Island Bourbon County brand Classic Cola Stout. So this is a version, a variation on their Bourbon County Stout, and it sounds a lot weirder than it tastes. So it is a stout aged in bourbon barrels with brown sugar, citrus, coriander, spices, and vanilla. So,
all right.
Calling it cola may be a little bit of a stretch, but it's really fucking good. So, I've got that I'm going to be sipping on for the rest of the episode. So, had to interject that in there.
Yeah, we did take a bit of time on the intro section here, but there's just so much world building and so much great stuff to talk about right off the bat that we can't skip it. So I feel you. All right. So with that, let's go into our official start of the series, chapter 1, as it's called. I mean, prologues are technically like generally world building, whatever. This is our start of the narrative, so to speak. Right. So Chapter 1, we've got our second prophecy here that we get in this book, and I think it's a really interesting one. One speaking of armies and tyrants and effectively making the life of our narrator one of severe consequence. This has the moral philosophizing of like a journal, similar to meditations, but also like an explanation of actions in some way. How did you think about this?
So to me, it felt like a diary or a journal or something to that effect. Is there any point in this, like in any of these 5 that we've read so far, or 4? How many? Prologue, like before
5.
prologue,
we've read 5.
1, 2, 3, and then before 4. Is there anything that reveals the gender of the person writing?
I don't believe so. I don't think there's anything that does. Yeah.
So I have 2 theories.
All right. This is almost a prediction.
It is. It is almost a prediction, but it's probably going to be a fairly overarching one, I'm guessing. It is written by either Kelsier or Vin. I'm inclined at this point to believe that it's Kelsier, but I feel like that's intentional, and I'm going to guess that it's Vin.
Okay. All right.
It truly, though, the biggest thing that it does for me is sets up the expectation that this story is going to be explosively immense and just really get into crazy things. Like we're dealing with characters that are like fighting or almost squabbling with like low-level nobles and jumping forward to the time when they're leading armies. Like, it's a jump, but I'm super here for the entire progression. So, yeah,
cool. I love that. love, again, we've talked about kind of the importance of these prophecies, and we're going to continually kind of reiterate them. It will forever be difficult for me to talk about these because, are you right? Are you wrong? I can't reiterate that. And that's kind of my goal, my part in the story here. But I do think that this does lend an immensity. It does lend a gravity to what this story is,
Right.
In all kinds of ways, and it could be anything. That's what's so fun right now. We're at the beginning. It could be anything. So there's this kind of like childhood giddiness to this right. That I adore. Yeah. I'm thinking about it. I'm noticing that just wafting off of you. So I have to mention it. So we are also, of course, introduced to Vin, a young ska girl watching the ash fall over our setting, the dark city of Luthadel. She's a part of a thieving crew, an enterprising group of ska upstarts who are stealing from the rich and works under the crew leader, Cayman. She's delivered with some baggage of her own, of course. She's got a rich history, but she's got the voice of Reen in her head, her brother, reminding her of her abusive past, and she acts fairly skittish to others because of how she's been treated over the years. What do you think of our new protagonist here? Protagonist might be aggressive, but she feels like a protagonist at the end.
She does.
Yeah.
That's absolutely how I thought of her. This so perfectly encapsulates the sort of humble beginnings trope of fantasy adventure stories and like basically any D&D campaign that's ever existed. Like it's so well done and satisfying to see that begin so cleanly. Like we're obviously jumping in past her trauma to a certain extent, maybe in the midst of it a little bit, but very, very humble and small and timid. So with that respect and that sort of outlook on things, it's exciting trying to get into that sort of mindset initially. It's frustrating and it's horrible that she had to deal with all of this growing up. So, cool to see that she's making a place for herself despite all of those hardships.
Yeah, I mean, it is narratively fantastic and a great way to get us to kind of like latch into a character very early on by giving them this kind of sense of trauma. I've talked about this previously on the podcast a couple of times, but one of my favorite books on writing that exists is Consider This by Chuck Palahniuk, and he talks at length about the idea of giving your main character trauma, and he tends towards the dead parent trauma because naturally one way or another people have experience there. Orphan trauma fits, abuse trauma fits, and just as long as it provides for the narrative and lends to the character flaws that you're trying to give a character, because in some way, shape, or form, loss is relatable, pain is relatable, and so that's why we see starts of the story like this. But there's a lot to unpack here, which I think is great. Like we don't get a full sense of what's going on with Vin yet. That's interesting for sure. This lends to that limited POV that we were talking about earlier.
For sure.
If we were omniscient, we might even know what's gone wrong, but we are not. So we move on, of course, from Vin to Cayman as we're introduced to him, and he is an absolute piece of shit, abusive man to a person he believes he owns because of a debt that her brother, Reen, again, saddled Vin with. But she does something curious when he goes back to hit her a second time. She uses up a bit of her luck, as she says, and his hand lowers. This is really curious, and we see it used a little bit more in later scenes with the Obligators. But what did you think about this curious power the first time that it was introduced?
So, I guess we talked about it a little bit. I really appreciated the physicality, and initially, she and entirely whenever she's talking about using luck, she talks about reaching out to apply it to somebody, essentially. And at least on my first read through of it, it felt, or my understanding of it was that she had to physically reach out and touch them. in order, like she had to physically touch the person that she was applying it to. And it makes more sense that that's not the case. And it is entirely how she feels about using it, that she is internally grabbing this resource and reaching out and touching somebody with it, touching their, I don't know, their aura, their sense, their spirit. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but she's applying it to somebody. I guess my point is I am most impressed with how great it feels to have this physicality to this resource. And the way she is so rationing with it and understands how little she has of it, and that we learn why later, but it's fun to that extent. But as far as Cayman actually is absolute piece of shit. Fuck that guy. I almost felt like he was, because of how it goes forward with this story, and he's like playing the role of this noble, and he's taking direction from Vin regularly, and like she's making suggestions, and he's playing, like he's accepting those suggestions and rolling with them, like how the proposed slaves are, or the servants are too well dressed for this character that he's trying to play. Mm-hmm. It felt to me initially that he was basically method acting and trying to get into that character and be this piece of shit noble. But that's not the case at all. He's just actually a fuckhead, and I hate him.
Yeah.
So
that's an interesting perspective, that he was trying to method act, and that kind of makes sense, especially in the way that like Vin is able to then address and say like you should have more like underlings around, more ska, less like well-dressed people and other things like that, because you're supposed to be displaying a poorhouse. It also kind of intuits a little bit of her understanding of the world, which I think is interesting on top of that. Like it gives it an interesting depth and complexity there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Even on a second read through, third, fourth, whatever, I've read it once and I've listened to it like 2 or 3 times.
Yeah.
Which is generally how I do this. For those of you who haven't kind of experienced this before, we have to read this shit a lot in order to really like be able to talk about it in depth, which gives kind of a unique perspective in its own right, but at the same time is a lot of time. And sometimes it's enough time that I can kind of forget what my initial like first read reaction was. But even subsequent readings, it felt less like that's his actual demeanor and more like he is trying to be like get his head in the game to a certain extent. That's not to say I think he's deep down a good person, but he is much more verbally violent and commanding at the beginning, and later on when he learns that Vin is planning on leaving, he's much more physically and aggressively violent in that respect. So there's still that sort of shift in personality between when he's preparing to be a nobleman and when he's like kind of celebrating the end of the heist.
It's a muted version of who he really is that we get right here. Likely because he can't actually damage Vin beyond, beyond, as we come to understand their relationship, like he can't continue to kind of go through that. So he obviously makes the choice, and there is, it sucks. This is shitty. So that's about all that I had to say about it for the most part. It sucks. It's shitty. Cayman fucking blows. And he's a piece of shit, but it also portrays like the kind of stuff that Vin has to put up with in order to avoid either enslavement or, I mean, worse to some degree. And that sucks as well inside of the Final Empire. So it's a difficult spot to be in. So The heist, of course, is one that we've kind of talked about a little bit here, is that of Cayman playing the part of a nobleman, Lord Jadu, in order to trick an obligator Laird into giving this crew their contract and paying it up front. What did you think of our little act of thievery here?
It was kind of impressive, especially the way... So, Cayman isn't, like... He isn't a bumbling idiot. He knows what he's doing, and he's, as far as I can tell, a fairly accomplished thief. Swindler, to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing how much is influenced by Vin and her luck is really cool, man. Like, I don't know, dude, I am so invested in this, like, magic system. I'm so excited about it. Like, I was geeking out over this the entire time. Holy shit. Because I don't know, I haven't read anything like this before, and it, for whatever reason, this sort of tangible, logical to a certain degree, but like logical in the sense that it follows its own rules and is strictly written to have rules that are followed. I appreciate and look for in this sort of, I would say, medium. I don't read that much, so it's not the medium, but in this sort of story.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I felt like this was a great way to practically introduce us to the way that this is used.
Yeah, definitely. And especially the way that it can also go, like, talent and skill like this can go completely unnoticed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it lends a perspective, a novice, like someone who doesn't even know that they're a novice in something. Like,
right.
Vin has no clue what she's actually doing. And that's fascinating. So
she mentions that. So we know that she's 16 years old, and we also know that she didn't know until she was 10 that this wasn't common.
Mm-hmm.
Like, she assumed everybody could do this until she was 10 years old. So she's only had 6 years of experience, which is, granted, pretty close to half of her life. At least half of the life that she can remember. I don't remember anything before I was
a lifespan,
3 or 4,
right.
or 4 or 5 years old. So
right, select memories from like younger than that, but yeah.
But like, it's not a long time for her to have honed these skills without any sort of training. So it's cool.
I totally agree. I think that that's what's so interesting here, is that she doesn't really know what she's doing, and we find out later, of course, that her power is derived from tin that's naturally available in the water. Or not.
Is
tin,
it tin?
Excuse me.
Do we know it's tin?
We don't know that it's something. We know that there are metals in the water.
Yeah.
Right.
Because we know
it's
tin.
It's not tin. It's specifically not tin.
Perspective. That's the only one we know for sure. The connection between the metal and the power to a certain extent.
Correct. Yes. Right. Which is why my brain said tin. It's not tin. But we know that there is metal in the water, and that's what Kelsier cites as her ability to kind of burn and use these powers a lot later. Our final scene, of course, of the chapter we talked about a little bit here is Vin burning up all of her luck to push Laird to bring Cayman's loss-leading proposal back to the Canton of Finance, effectively a ministry, any sort of political institution, to have them reconsider the vote and take this kind of trade deal. You kind of mentioned a lot of the stuff about luck. Any other final thoughts in this chapter? So
I guess the only thing that I haven't really mentioned explicitly, I guess, is how this is different than other magic systems, in that a lot of magic systems rely on spells, and certain let's think about D&D, because that's probably on both of our minds, because we have one or more projects going on regarding it.
Sure. Yeah.
There is a limited spell pool, like a limited amount of spells that you can cast per day. And like, you can kind of think of that as a limited number, or like a limited amount of magical essence that can be expended per day. And you can allocate, like, each spell takes up a specific amount. so you have to allocate it that way. This is so much more finite than that, in that you can really choose how much of this resource to take to apply it to something. So the more you take, the more intense it is. And it really changes the way you think about magic to a certain extent. If you're tuned into that sort of thought process that RPGs, video games or tabletop RPGs or anything else have to rely on because of just the mechanics of the way that the content is consumed in gameplay. You know?
I love that you're bringing this up, because this is actually one of the very frequent reviews of this first book in some degree, is that there are moments of this that feel like they're a video game or like a tabletop game, like you're saying, because the limits are so strict that it feels like our characters are behaving in ways in which they have to react to a mathematical equation to some degree, which I think is great. I think it feels a very realistic feeling world. But that is actually one of like the common reviews of this entire thing, is it has this feeling of like video game-ness over the top of it. Not strictly, not entirely, but I think you hit the nail on the head as to why it kind of has that gameplay-like feeling.
Yeah, but I'd also argue that it goes more in depth than that and distinguishes itself from it based on the fact that this isn't a mechanic that you could program into a game easily. Mm-hmm. You could. I'm sure you could.
People are trying actively.
Yeah.
For the record.
I'm positive, because I'm 60 pages into this fucking thing and I'm hooked. Like, of course there are people that are obsessed with this and are trying to like convert it into a video game. Absolutely. And I will 100% play it if one exists, or if it doesn't, whenever it does. But intuitively, it seems so granular that it would be so difficult to actually do in that respect. I don't know, man. I'm just
I'm just loving
excited.
The shit out of this. Yeah,
I'm just happy.
Mm-hmm. Isn't it? I mean, the dourness of the last book that we read to this is like, even though this is dour, is so intriguing and insightful, and you feel like you're ready to bite off a chunk of something new. So yeah,
mm-hmm.
I'm very here for it. I think it's nice to be in kind of a limited series, like a trilogy that we know kind of the end of. We've got like a finish line in sight to some degree, and that's also new and fun. So with that, we move into chapter 2. Our third little journey entry of this week is one that mentions the Terrace prophecies and how our mysterious author will have the power to save the world according to them, or perhaps to destroy it.
Ugh, dude. Fuck.
Yeah.
Grandiose, just big, expanding world that we are being drawn into. It's these sort of interspersings of journal entries before every chapter just creates this satisfaction in expansion and just being ripped out of that. Like, I guess not ripped out of it, but just these snippets of the future that don't actually tell you almost anything, but you just get to see how big things will get. And it is a promise epicness.
Oh yeah. That's a great way of putting it.
Like, that's what it feels like, at least. It's a promise
to be kept. Yeah.
Yeah. And I am so fucking excited. I keep saying that and I keep bringing it up, but like this is the most excited I've been for any sort of like story that I've put myself through, be it TV show or book or anything. Like, this is the most gripping of anything that I've experienced before.
Wow. All right. I'm stoked. For that reaction. I'll tell you what, I loved the way that these chapters played out. I think I talked about this earlier, but I love the idea, this like subtle hint of things. And like I said, it's like we're getting a whisper of the mythology right now, and like the world, be it the future, be it the past, be it the present, whatever it is, we're getting a whisper of that reality. And that is a driving force here in the beginning of the story for sure. I love that. I love that you're in love with it. It's like, so good.
Did you expect me to be like this?
You know, here's the problem, PJ. You've read so little that transitioning from science fiction to fantasy, I was a little concerned to some degree, like a little bit.
I genuinely would have thought that I would have resonated more with science fiction, but this feels more mathy. Like this feels more. This feels more like rooted in somehow. This feels more rooted in reality than science fiction does somehow. And maybe that is such a broad brush to paint this with, but I don't know. I don't know how to describe it better than that.
Yeah, man. And like, I know that you have a love for Tolkien. I know that you have a love for Lord of the Rings and things like that too. So I know that you really enjoy fantasy, but the transition from us reading two standalone science fiction novels taking place on Earth to a future Earth series to this fantasy series that has fuck all to do with anything else is, it was a concern for a hot second. I'm not going to lie. Part of the problem with starting this project is it's like, okay, if PJ doesn't like it, we've 6 months of like trying to make this entertaining. It's a real concern, which I'm happy that you're reacting positively, and I'm sure all of our listeners are too. But it was a genuine thing that I thought about for a long time as I was going through it, more than any of the other things that we've mentioned so far this episode. That's what I'm most nervous about, right, with all of these. And because I also can't like answer your questions if it causes like serious anxiety or like you have a plot problem or stuff like that. Like I can't be like, no, just keep, I can't like literally say, no, just keep going, because we're going to keep going naturally. But I need to like kind of ease it in other ways. It's so interesting. We're in a unique predicament, I think. But
I also know that that's the situation we're in, so I'm not going to be like, I'm not going to seek out answers from you and like ask you questions, because I know that things will either be revealed later or I'll be disappointed, and it's one of the two.
If it were strictly bad, we also wouldn't be reading it. Like, regardless, like if I read it and I'm like, even if it was the most voted thing, if it were strictly bad, I'd be like, no, we're not fucking doing that. That's a waste of everyone's time.
That's a good point.
So regardless of everyone's feelings at home, thank you for voting. Thank you for putting your input in. But also, like, if you give me bad opinions on things, like I'm not gonna take it seriously.
So this is like pseudo democracy.
At the very least, your vote is very serious, very real. I read the entire book series because of people's votes. I liked it quite a bit, which is why we're talking about it. But if sucked,
this is real life Tropico.
Yes, exactly. If I were reading Ice Planet Barbarians, whatever the fuck, it's a sex novel. I would not.
It's a sex novel. All right.
It literally is. It's like a 60, 80 page crazy ass. It's fucking wild. If people recommended that, we would not read that on the show after I read it, probably. Outside of for maybe a meme, but that would be it.
This cannot be pages. A 6 month. We could do that meme. As a single episode.
I'm not going to commit to a 6 month meme as it stands, but you're right. We could do that as a single episode. I think it's just called the Ice Planet Barbarians, if I remember correctly. But regardless,
yeah. Sorry, we got off track.
The meat of chapter 2. So we've talked a lot about like the total world building here that happens inside of this, but the meat of the chapter starts with how fucking cool Luthadel is. It's this vast city with grand spires spiraling up from these squat 3-story buildings. It gives this like very European Gothic architecture vibe in my head. Everything is blackened with ash. We've got different citadels that are stationed around it that are owned by the noblemen. It leaves this interesting portrait of this ash being stained across the parapets of all of these different buildings and walls by the rain, and it's just so fascinating. There's also the Cretic Shaw, the Hill of 1,000 Pillars, the Palace of the Lord Ruler. That's all the same thing, by the way. I just said it like it was 3 separate things. It's all the same thing. But just like fucking wow, what a visual picture we get. Also, I feel like it is fucking worthless. It's so upsetting to me physically that the Ska are like brushing away the ash. So it just like keeps falling. And it's like, fuck.
Yeah.
What a shitty job to have. But what do you think of the visual of Luthadel?
So that's one thing that I am very bad at. And okay. So let me kind of get into this. In regards to Red Rising or anything that I've read prior to that, I know when I want to see something like adapted to screen or illustrated or something like that, but I'm so bad at actually visualizing things in my own head.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And that, like,
we've talked about that before.
We have talked about that before, but I don't think it's an actual reason, but I think it's something that has kept me.
I think it's a lack of experience. Like,
maybe
you've only had so many.
That's true, but I also just don't. When I think of things, I don't visualize them in that sort of way. Like I don't. I think of it in words more than in any sort of visualization.
That's so interesting because my brain, and you're an engineer, right? My brain goes to like CAD software. Like, how would I build this? And I'm like thinking about like how the circumference of like circles and the spirals spiral out of, and how like cones up to the top. And I think about all these like different things. When you say like a hill of spires, I'm like, there's so much that could be there.
Yeah. So like I've actually done a lot of research into this. And there are conditions, like I hesitate to call it conditions, but for the sake of this, conditions where people cannot visualize things in their brain. And that is a certain percentage of the population where that is entirely true. And I feel like I'm close to that. I can still I can imagine things. I can visually create things in my mind, but it's so rare and so limited, and it takes a lot of just dedicated actual like processing power to actually do that. Because I mostly just think in terms of words and numbers and stuff. So I would love to see this city illustrated. And I think I told you that. And I think you put a picture in our Discord. Is that correct?
I did. And I've also saved the link. So that particular picture from Rick HD will be inside of our show notes. So you can see. I'm going to go
look at it right now.
Yeah, there are a couple of other photos that I wanted to choose instead, but they included a very minor spoiler that is in the front of the spoiler itself is on the front of the hardback of the first edition. So it's not a crazy spoiler, but it's something that you haven't seen yet. And so I'm excited to see your reaction to how it's described. So I didn't want to break that immersion. So instead I chose this one as the sort of just the city of Luthadel, the keep surrounding the Hill of 1,000 Spires, Creedic Shaw.
This is dope, man.
It's fucking insane.
This is fucking awesome.
The other thing that I want to say, talking about this photo, talking in general, I have this internal thing that I've thought about a lot. People named Shaw are generally villains. Things named after Shaw are generally villains.
This is K. Shaw.
This is literally K. Shaw, which is like you. Literally me, but it's just so interesting. Yeah.
Okay. I'm satisfied. Now we can kind of skip past that part. But
cool.
Yeah,
I just want to oh my god, the visuals. Yeah. I mean, this was bound to be a long episode as is. So, folks, generally we aren't quite this long, but strap in.
Strap in. Let's get going.
Sure. So, great conversation. From Kelsier's perspective in this chapter, we learn a couple of critical details about how the great houses of Luthadel, and in turn the noblemen inside them, come to reside in their grand keeps. Namely, those noblemen inside of Luthadel rely on their economic supremacy. There are other noblemen, of course, throughout the city, throughout the regions, as we've learned about the north, but they're really defined by their lineage as previous supporters of the Lord Ruler at some point or another. This is interesting, considering so far the book has defined the line between noblemen and Ska as one of kind of semi-racial It's not fully explained, of course, at this point, but it also feels like it's defined in some ways by economic stature and this like bloodline history thing. Did you have thoughts here?
So I didn't pick up on anything racial, and maybe that's just me missing it. But I didn't pick up on anything racial as far as the delineation between.
When I say racial, I'm thinking like elves, dwarves, if that makes sense.
Oh, I didn't pick up on anything other than
sure, and that's
existing.
Great. That's totally okay. I just want to make sure that racial was clear there. I'm thinking elves, dwarves, not like different colors of skin.
That's fine either way. Regardless, in both respects, I didn't pick up on that at all. I had assumed the entire time that it had entirely been based on bloodline. To a certain extent, that's correct. Like, it is the descendants of the initial supporters of the Lord Ruler that are, at least, have the ability to become the noble class. We don't really know if there's anything between noble and ska. They don't really talk about that very much. I'm assuming there's a populace that is not slave, but is also not like noble. But we haven't been experienced, or we haven't been exposed to that at all yet, have we? I don't think so.
No.
Travelers. I guess initially they talk about travelers. The ska do. What's his name?
Go from place to place. Yeah.
In the prologue, Menace talks about, and that band of ska, that hovel of ska, talk about the travelers, and they make that delineation between traveler and other ska, but that's the only sort of intermediary between ska and noble that we know of at this point.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's so many. Again, we talked about world building inside of this quite a bit, but there are so many questions that are left lingering here, and I think this is just another example of one of those tendrils that is kind of left out for you to like try to discern exactly what it is, but we don't have an answer yet. Yeah, so I was just curious on your thoughts to start with. So, in this perspective from Kelsier, we are also introduced to Doxson, and we also begin to get a sense of their relationship when they're talking about how Kelsier accidentally kills a nobleman, and how they had a previous relationship potentially before whatever happened to Kelsier happened. You know, with a knife to the chest, or rather a pair of knives, pays to be careful to kill trusting as he speaks. He also switches to the sort of wistfully negative tone, thinking internally. Sometimes Kelsier felt that a ska misting's life wasn't so much about surviving as it was about picking the right time to die. What'd you make of Doxson and kind of Kelsier interacting with another character that he knows, another person that he knows?
So, do we know what Doxson is at this point? Like, I know later on it's mentioned that neither Kelsier or Doxson are mistings. We don't explicitly see him perform any allomancy unless he's working, like, the only thought is maybe he's working in conjunction with Kelsier during the scene where he's calming the emotions of Vin's compatriots. But we do know that he's not a misting. Mistling? No, what's the term?
Misting. Yep.
We know he's not a misting, which at this point, based on what we've been exposed to through the end of the chapters that we're reading today, because it's not at this point yet, and I'm jumping forward and I apologize, but
no, it's okay.
It's been on my mind ever since meeting him. He is either a Mistborn, or he is someone mundane, or like mortal, or however you want to describe it, somebody non-magical, or something else entirely. And it's very, either it's explicitly left out from description, or I'm missing something, and I'm not sure which. So if you have insight on that, otherwise I'm going to assume that he's something else.
I would say that I think that you are on the money. Thoughts about what Dockson could be. Could he be something inside of a different magic system that we maybe don't understand? Could he be as we understand them at the end of this chapter, there are Mistings and Mistborn. There's no combination of like you can use two metals. It's if you can use more than one metal, you can use them all, right?
Right.
So as we understand it, that means from our perspective, Dockson is either a Mistborn or a nobody. However, leaving the future open, nobody meaning like no magical potential for the record, like not saying that he's actually a nobody. But leaving the intention open, kind of like you're thinking, there is potential for him to be something else, and like maybe Kelsier's hinting at that, and that's I think something that's kind of left up to the viewer to try to discern how much they trust this point of view, right? That we get from both Kelsier and now from Vin on Kelsier.
Right. The one exception to that, and I don't know if it's actually an exception, we do know that obligators or high level obligators at least. Mm-hmm. Are trained to know when they've been tampered with. It's unclear at this point if that is another source or a completely separate source of mystical ability, or if it's just kind of mortal training on how to understand when your mind is being tampered with.
Right.
Which is something else entirely. But Dockson is a very interesting character, and I am excited to see where we go with him and what he is, if anything.
I totally agree. I think that like Dockson and this question that kind of like Kelsier poses very near the end of this entire section that we're going to read is an interesting one. And I think jumping into it here makes a lot of sense, because a lot of times this story is going to be more, it's going to have some feedback loops inside of it where it's like, what's real, what's not, what's our question, what's looking forward. I think that's an interesting difference versus something that we've read before. So the feedback loop here inside of the story will be fun to discuss. So any other thoughts on anything else relating to kind of that conversation?
I don't think so. I think that's
okay. All right.
I mean, obviously, so I guess that's one sort of world building point that we kind of get here, in that Kelsier burned down a noble's home and like his mansion, freed all of the ska that were working underneath him. And this is not like, obviously people know about it and word is being spread and like information is being distributed, but it isn't it isn't regarded as like a high alert act of terrorism or anything like that. This is not necessarily a common thing, but it's not a thing that raises nationwide concern, as far as I can tell. You know, it's like, oh, you were the one behind that shit, like blah 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 blah. Like it's not.
That's interesting. Yeah,
it's not a thing that brings the entire it's not something that makes the Lord Ruler tighten up security on a tangible level from our perspective at this point yet.
Yes, and I think we are kind of removed from that, like you're suggesting. But again, the reality of this exchange that they're having near the end here is about this new job, right? They're talking about the other things. They're talking about what Kelsier has done, the violence enacted, and the way that like maybe the people aren't reacting. And some of that might be attributed to the Lord Ruler's power structure and how he might want to keep these kind of rebellions quiet, what have you. Could be something there. But there's a little bit of planning together here with Dockson, and Dockson is kind of like both shocked at the return of Kelsier as well as excited inside of this conversation. He's also a little bit wary of some of the changes that he sees despite his positive familiarity with the man. He even goes so far as to say, after Kelsier talks about sneaking in Dimension, oh, that'll take some getting used to. And that's kind of curious.
Yeah, it's very curious. So in the aftermath of that conversation and the extension of that conversation, Kelsier explicitly mentions that Dockson is used to working with Mistings before. And Doxson responds with with something along the lines of this being different. So this got my wheels turning. This got my gears going a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what the fuck is Doxson? And there's a couple different sort of paths that we could follow here. Maybe it's a Mistborn versus Misting thing. Like, he's worked with Mistings before, but like a Mistborn that can deal with all of these things is something new to him.
Sure.
Like, cause Mistings are fucking tiny, insignificant, like bullshit, whatever people that don't matter to the story anymore, cause Mistborns exist.
Oh my God. All right. I mean,
1 in 10,000 ska.
Yeah.
Or not 1 in 10,000 half-breeds are Mistings.
Correct.
Right?
I believe that's right.
I think that's what they said. So
that's Mistings, not Mistborn.
Right.
Right.
They don't give a figure for Mistborns, but you know, do you think you've met 10,000 people in your life?
No. Not like that, like know my name.
And
probably.
So Kelsier mentions that he's only met one other Mistborn ska in his life. This is going later. Sorry, I'm getting into the math here.
Yeah, no, I think it's important.
So 1 in 10,000 half-breed ska are Mistborn, or Mistings, which is 0.01%. And presumably Mistborns are incredibly rare even among them. So obviously Kelsier is intentionally seeking out Mistings. So like that skews the numbers a bit, but like that's fucking crazy how few there would be then. But you know, all world building, we have no idea the scale of anything. We have no idea what the population of, we don't know what the ska population is. We don't know what the general population is. We know nothing. But anyway, I figured I'd get that out of the way. But we know that Kelsier is specifically adept to stealth things. It's hard to tell if that's like going invisible or teleportation or something like that. And whether or not that's a normal Mistborn ability or not. Maybe Doxson is able to sense when allomancy is being performed, much like the obligators maybe are. Like maybe it's something like that. Like he's from the same descent as the obligators are, and it has been trained into knowing when allomancy is being performed. But for whatever reason, Kelsier doesn't give off the same signals or the same, like he's able to do it in a way that isn't detectable. Like those are the thoughts running through my mind when I'm like trying to think of like what this conversation was a point of a lot of thought for me, if you can't tell.
Yeah, no, I love that though. I think that's a great thing to have happen. And I think that's kind of like this entire first section that I've picked out here for us to read is a lot of questions and like some answers, but not everything's answered yet. I'm sorry for how much of a ramble that was, by the way. No, it was good. It was good, man. Like speculating on your thoughts are great. So I'm super excited. I'm super excited. So there's a lot of terminology, kind of like you said, that's kind of being thrown around here when discussing the potential crew that we have here building. We've got Ham, who's mentioned, Breeze, a dead man named Trap, of whom is no longer going to be an option for the crew as the crew's smoker, before proposing Clubs and his Tin Eye cousin. He also talks about his brother Marsh before Doxson brings up something that's worth his time. What'd you get out of this sort of brief end to this conversation? Heist movie setup.
I'm so fucking here for it. I'm so excited. Like, this is a band of wacky named characters getting together to pull something off, and I'm so excited.
It's a fucking heist book, dude. Like, it's a heist book. Like, how fucking... a fantasy heist book. Like, how cool is that?
This is so fucking neat. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all that's gone through my mind here. Like, oh, that's a fun name. Tin Eye, obviously, I'm assuming means they can perceive things well, because we know that when Kelsier taps into his tin reserves, he is able to hear hear things from a great distance away. The light in the room gets brighter. He like all of his senses are heightened. So I'm assuming Tin Eye is the lookout of the group.
Great call. Love that.
That's the only one.
There's an intensification of senses for sure.
Yeah.
Like it all intensifies.
Exactly. Smoker is the only one that, like, smoker is a term that we get here and we don't really get a whole lot of explanation for it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing it's something kind of the inverse of the Tin Eye, in that maybe it's obfuscating somebody else's senses. So like instead of heightening your own, it's dulling somebody else's. So creating a smoke screen in a metaphorical term. But that's all I get as far as what can be made from those names.
Yeah. I you know, man, I am so glad that you latched into the like heist idea of this right away, because that is very clearly what it's going for. And it's you know, like what do I even say at this point? Yeah, you're right. Without like very clearly, the story spells out the fact that you're correct. Like, I'm not spoiling anything in advance. It appears to be the building of a heist crew. This appears to be assembling a group of people with particular skills to pull something off. We don't know what that something is yet.
Heist, I guess, technically implies that they're stealing something, but I think we can go a little bit more broad than that, and they're not necessarily going to steal something, but they're going to do something covertly, you know? Like,
Sure.
And I feel like that still falls in the same category.
Yeah, it definitely does. But yeah, the fantasy heist book, how fucking wild. So we cut from there back to Vin, and we see that she's continuing the curious habit of always being aware of the nearby exits, looking for her way out if she needs to run. She's sort of haunted by these traumas that of Reen, of the men in her life, like Cayman. It's been kind of a hard path for her, and you can't really blame her for any of these reactions and kind of feelings that she has on the front end. There are a ton of refrains of her running through her head, and she's in these moments she's thinking about how her brother is basically talking to her and saying, like, anyone can betray you, anyone. And she just has this very interesting internal monologue, and I kind of want to get your thoughts on what that internal story is like for her.
Well, I mean, she's clearly like deeply traumatized, and seemingly has yet to find anybody that actually cares for her. Mm-hmm. She talks very fondly about Reen, but the only nice act from him that she actually explicitly mentions is that he rescued her from her mother, and from the situation she was in before. She even mentions that Reen has, I don't know if this is a quote, but it's very close to a quote, that he would always abandon her. Like, or so that Reen always said that he would abandon her, I think.
Yep. Right. Would always, like, eventually there was this promise of being left alone.
Yeah. And he did. And that hurts too. But getting later on in the chapters, it seems like he wasn't that great to her either. Like there was some abuse there. And maybe I'm misremembering, and maybe I'm just thinking about like when they were together and she was abused. But I feel like he wasn't like strictly great to her regardless. And
I think that's the picture painted at this point, is that he was not great to her despite doing some good things for her.
Yeah. He saved her from being killed, but that's about it as far as we understand at this point for what he did for her.
Yeah. He appeared to try to provide some like hard lessons, but did he actually? Did they matter? Were they important? You know, it's a question in and of itself.
Really, it's the thing driving her to stay here with this crew is the fact that she is terrified of being alone. So like, even though she's being beaten and abused and traumatized constantly, at least she's not alone. And apparently that's enough for her to continue working with them.
Yeah. And That hurts. Like it hurts from a narrative perspective for this character that we were beginning to know and kind of like try to come to understand. We move from that introduction and kind of the internal monologue to that of our run-in, or second run-in, I should say, with an obligator, this time the High Prelin Ariev. And Kamen sort of begs for this deal. He's coming out and he's very subservient. He's cutting out a middleman here. Later, we learn that the High Prelin being here is really just a tactic to suss out people like Vin who are pushing on people's emotions, and that this was all really about capturing her because of the understanding of the obligators that we get from Kelsier's perspective more than anything else.
So this is initially, I remember like wondering if this was, because we know that Vin is paranoid about the way this goes.
Yeah.
I was curious until we learned later if this was kind of a strategic move by the obligator to trap him to a certain extent,
Right.
or if they had the ability to understand what had happened, but only after the fact, you know, if they're still going to act as if they were under their influence, but then later could know like, hey, they fucked with me. Let's go get them, you know, like,
right.
And maybe that's not that important of a nuance, but in this case, I feel like it is. And it seems to be the case is that they know when they're being tampered with, and this obligator decided to just let him go with it to try to source where they're hiding.
Correct. Yeah. I think that's more accurate, especially as we consider what Kelsier later does with the Steel Inquisitor, right? Like the way that he handles kind of the judgment arm of this organization is interesting, right? Like he chooses to distract the Steel Inquisitor. We know that there are other people, of course, that are chasing them down, but the Inquisitor is interesting. We'll get there for sure. But yeah, I think I agree with you for the most part. I think that that's kind of the role of the obligator, right? Is to be this middleman that isn't responsible for justice, but is more like an inverted detective in its own way. Like as opposed to a detective going to solve a murder, they're instead showing up and waiting for them to be acted against, which is interesting.
Right.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring something up here that's a little bit interesting as we're talking about the canton of finance and money and components like that. The currency in this world is called boxings. And I listened to, I think I mentioned this in episode 0, but I listened to all of Brandon Sanderson's lectures on how to build a fantasy world and how to build and world build and write your novel of your dreams. And I think he did a great job. That lecture is incredible. That lecture set, I should say. I think there's 13 or 14 episodes. That lecture set is absolutely incredible. I think it's crucial for a lot of people that want to think in the same way that Brandon does. I think that it's a great way to kind of think about your intro to how you might tell a story. And one of the things that he mentioned offhandedly, I believe, was that it's important to not name things that sound stupid when they're repeated. And it was almost implied, I feel like he mentioned, but I can't remember quite precisely right now. Didn't have time to double check. But I think that he was specifically talking about the fact that he called currency in Mistborn boxings. I think he was a little bit grumpy about that in the later terms. But it's an interesting to think about the importance of terminology in a world like this.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. It works. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
But it felt unnecessarily distinct from anything else for that reason. Like, I don't know if it's the right way to describe it, but a little bit cheesy and corny to a certain extent.
It is the corniest thing of the story. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's fine. Like, I don't have a problem with it. It's just, I can absolutely believe that if this was reapproached, this would get like edited and changed and whatever. But at the same time, I'm sure there's some sort of lore, if not explicitly written somewhere in Brandon Sanderson's head about why it's named boxings. Because it seems like granted, this is the first, 60 pages of the book, but it seems like he is very calculated in the way that he writes things. Especially with the fact that there are all these like flash forward points. So like we know where this is going to go hypothetically, which means it's been thought about and has been kind of pre-written to a certain extent. So I'm sure there's a reason behind the term boxings. It just sounds fucking dumb. So
right. Yeah, it's definitely hard to quantify on your side of things to like try to come up with an understanding of what exactly, like it is money. We can understand that it's money, but from our perspective, calling it boxings is just so strange. It's one of the small things that like whatever your fantasy thesaurus and dictionary are, like keep that in mind when you're writing. I think it's interesting.
Yeah. And that is to be said that from the outside looking in, if you're not familiar with it being a currency, dollars sounds just as dumb. So like,
our familiarity is half the problem for sure.
Yeah. Like that's the biggest point of it. But playing into that to a certain extent, it like I said, unnecessarily distinct, but not to the point where it's a sticking point for me. Like it didn't bother me, but it was different enough that it stuck out.
Yeah. That makes sense to me. From there, we cut back to Kelsier and we get a bit more information on allomancy and trace minerals and the water supply being the source of the metals that Vin is burning. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but after that little info dump that we get, we also meet a truly terrifying visage of a creature, a steel Inquisitor, a man with two giant metal spikes driven through his eye holes and out the other side, and left with like these little like dime plates on the front of their face. I think that is absolutely terrifying, and the fact that it's coming for Vin is she has no idea what's going on. And I think in a big way, this guy alone kind of shifts the tone of the story to me. I find this very terrifying, this description horrifying.
I mean, I didn't find the description of the Steel Inquisitor to be particularly terrifying at all. Based on the way it was described, it was like a big person with CDs strapped to their eye holes.
Oh my God.
Like that's what I imagine me, a big person with like CDs over my face. Now that like, I'm not going to diminish the fact that like the characters are terrified of it. So like clearly it is an imposing figure, but for whatever reason, like it didn't grip me as a particularly intimidating presence. But I mean, that's just me not being able to visualize things. Maybe again.
I sent you right now while we're sitting here a visualization that I had kind of stored away here for this moment, and I just want your impression on the picture. Again, this will be in the show notes so that everyone else can see.
I'm not going to say it looks dumb, but it doesn't look terrifying. It just looks like a big dude with spikes instead of eyes.
But he doesn't have eyes. Like, how does he see? Like, that's
the spikes.
Okay. What do you mean?
I don't know what I mean.
Okay. We know that everything is so well defined in this world that the idea of this guy kind of like walking around reminds me, my first impression of, this is such a strange pull, but my first impression of a Steel Inquisitor when I heard the description was that it was very similar to Malthael in the Diablo 3 expansion description. When he shows up in that cinematic, what's it called? Reaper of Souls?
Reaper of Souls, yeah.
Reaper of Souls. When he shows up in that cinematic for the Reaper of Souls, he reminds me in a lot of ways of the way that I think of the depiction of kind of the fear and terror that these people hold, these Inquisitors hold. And the spikes through the eyes just gave it this physical feeling in the same way that the hood with nothing underneath makes Malthael feel very strange and foreign and terrifying. Yeah, that's what I got. But understood. I just wanted to clarify at the very least because, like, I had to give you some visual. If you can't visual, oh my God, you send that back. No, it's not CDs. There are no CDs in the front of this guy's face. I understand that they're circles, but they're like They're fucking like at the bottom of pint glasses, maybe. Jesus Christ. You're fired. CD strapped to their eye holes. How dare you? All right. So anyway, I think they're scary. You're like, which is funny in and of itself. So at the end of the scene, Kelsier, realizing what needs to be done to potentially save Vin and otherwise, he downs the 8 basic elementic metals: iron, steel, tin, pewter, copper, bronze, zinc, and brass, before yanking on the emotions of the Inquisitor to give it a run through the streets of Luthadel.
So, like I mentioned before, we know tin, and that increases perception. We know that there are 2 that Vin experiences after this. One of subduing emotions, one of inflaming emotions. I'm of the opinion that it's probably the same metal that causes both of those, but it's not super clear because there's 2 sources that she's tapping into distinctively. But maybe it's just 2 different piles of the same thing. I don't fucking know. Whatever.
Yep.
But we don't know what any of the other metals are attributed to, and I am so excited to see what all of the other ones actually do. And if there's any way to suss out what they might be doing based on what metal they are. And I don't know. What's weird to me is that iron and steel are distinct here, which same with like copper and bronze.
Or brass.
And brass. Like, I'm curious how many of these are going to overlap and be like derivatives of each other, or if they're all going to be explicitly distinct. So
sure. Yeah.
I don't know.
All right.
But I like that we know all 8 of them right now.
Yeah, right. That we've got a sense of these right off the bat. Cool. With that scary run that Kelsier is running through, we move into chapter
very
3.
scary CD, man.
I swear to God, I'm in my Our 4th journal entry of the week is one that talks about Terrace and the people who live there, as well as their prophecies and religions as the ones that drive the world. Any thoughts that you have right here off this prophecy?
So in regard to the prophecies, which are pretty heavily emphasized through several of these entries, I'm inclined to believe that this is rooted in some sort of magical system. Whether or not it's the same allomancy, I don't know. I'm almost going to straight up guess that it's something else. Some other fantastical magical system that also exists but is separate. It seems more than just prophecy and instead actual peering into the future.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So we'll move on from the prophecy, of course, to starting with
no
Vin
follow
here.
up there. You're not gonna
well
reveal something to me.
No, absolutely not. The goal here is to not reveal, but to like let
That's
you
the point.
speculate. And I think that's also a fun point of these prophecies, right? Is like let you speculate and kind of these are almost in their own right like predictions of sorts that we might have on top of the entire episode. So we start with Vin, of course, sitting in her corner, immediately suspicious of the windfall of 3,000 boxings that the Canton parted with so easily. She tries to convince her friend Ulif that they need to leave. She gathers up her small set of belongings to do so. Pebbles from any of the cities that she's been to, a small earring that Vin's mother had given her, and a small piece of obsidian. Do you have any thoughts on these belongings and what they might mean?
I mean, they're just so simple, meager belongings. And as I mentioned before, it just embodies the idea of humble beginnings. We are so, and maybe it's just me, and for whatever reason resonating with this character, but I feel so perfectly poised to become deeply, deeply emotionally attached to her and her story and her growth. I don't know. I don't know why. I have no idea why this is gripping me so much. Like there are some things like the really tangible, crunchy magic system that I'm like, I know that's something I would gravitate towards. But I don't know why this is making me like emotionally attached to her. I don't understand that, but it's happening and I like it. So, I don't know. I'm here.
All right.
I'm ready.
All right. I dig that. She gathers up these small parts of what exactly she's trying to assemble to leave the place. She, of course, can't take the bigger things like her bedroll and otherwise without tipping off other people. And she comes to this horrible realization when she emerges from gathering her things to find that Eulif, her friend, is whispering to Cayman and stirring him into a rage as she is set to leave. He throws a stool at her, beats her, and of course, in those moments, Reen's voice comes back to her, seemingly whispering in her ear in this moment. Fool, ruthlessness, it's the most logical of emotions. You don't have any friends in the underworld. You'll never have any friends in the underworld. This is, what do you think?
God, it's tragic and it's disgusting. So, like, first of all, like, we know she's a 16-year-old girl, and it is despicable that he would do that to her in general.
Yeah.
Like, but beyond that, we also know that she is a small person, looks even smaller and younger than what you would think of as a 16-year-old girl, which in a very depressing way, she immediately like talks about that as being something that some men would like anyway, which is fucking horrifying.
Right.
But bringing it,
which is why she's not feminine, and that's why she doesn't like put the earring in most of the time.
Yeah, but beyond that, just this world sucks, and I know that's true for our world too, and that's horrifying and just awful in and of itself. But Cayman specifically, like, this is coming from a separate thing, and it doesn't seem to be at all connected to who she is or like her age or her gender or her size or anything at all. It's just that she's below him and she dare decide to leave. This makes it seem like, and gives the realization that this isn't a band and a group at all. This is Cayman employing basically slaves to do his heist bidding, because obviously based on those belongings, she doesn't get a cut of any of that, presumably.
She especially doesn't because of the debt of Reen, right? Like,
she
was saddled with it. Well, I'm just saying, in addition, she also doesn't get anything. Like, maybe all of these people are kind of in a similar circumstance to what you're describing, but in addition, she doesn't get it because of the debt that Reen left.
Yeah.
So
it's just bullshit.
He especially feels onerous of her, right? Like,
yeah, it
is bullshit for sure.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel strongly about this absolute pig of a person.
Yeah. No, Cayman, like, so does Kelsier, right? Like, Kelsier inside of the room is able to detect these things on the outside before the Steel Inquisitor stuff. And he is very much like thinking about how he is going to deal with this man reasonably. And it feels like he's trying to avoid just killing him because that would be too clean in a large way. And we'll talk about that more in a second. But yeah. To that point, though, like, Kelsier, a complete stranger to Vin as of yet, bursts through the door and throws Cayman against the wall, pushing him with something that Vin isn't able to perceive. She also feels her emotions squelched, helping her deal with the pain in the moment of what's already happened to her, as well as the emotional pain, as this mysterious stranger enters her life and uses, as she says, her luck on herself. Or luck on herself, not her luck. You know.
Yeah. I know what you mean. But this is awesome. And, like, talk about just, like, perfect timing. And obviously this is a narratively, like, driven book. Like, obviously he's going to write this to, like, happen at the most dramatic time. So it's whatever. But, like, it is perfect timing from her perspective of being saved from a horrible beating or worse. I think the other, beyond the satisfaction of Cayman being reprimanded to a certain extent, it also begins building this myth of Kelsier and the fact that a lot of the crew know who he is. So that's a fun, different, separate aspect of this story and this part of the story. But it's just satisfying to see this man get dressed down verbally and physically and letting his crew take care of him. I don't know.
Yep. Kelsier, of course, from there, like you said, he dresses them down. He goes on to explain how Cayman's crew is in his debt for dealing with the seemingly immortal Inquisitor, leading them off of their trail, as well as the Prelin and others who are looking for the opportunity to hunt them down. His price, of course, is the 3,000 boxings that they receive from the job, the punishment of Cayman for being an awful, shitty fucking person, and a private conversation with Vin alone in the safe house. Malev, the new crew leader, quickly agrees. What spawns from there, of course, is a wonderful conversation about Vin's potential.
Yeah. So one thing that you didn't actually mention, but I thought was really interesting and brings to question some other things within Kelsier's powers or not. And I'm curious what you think of this. He mentions that he knows about the spies within the walls looking through the cracks to see what's going on, and instructs to have them brought out and leave with them as well. Does he say there's 4 of them?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
I think he does.
There's a couple aspects of this. Like, he can either feel the people to feel, in quotes, I guess, the people that he affects with luck, if it's like an area of effect thing. Like, I'm, again, looking at this from a video game perspective to a certain extent. Like, if he is doing this mass luck expenditure and is able to feel who he's affecting within that sort of range and know exactly how many people he's affecting and where they are, that's one option. He might have some extra way perceptively what's going on, like if it's part of Tin's powers and he's really granularly able to detect movement or sound or anything like that, to the point of being able to hear where they are within the walls. Or if he just understands, if he just somehow previously knows about this place and what's around and how they operate. If he did research on this troop or this location that they're calling home at this moment, something like that. There's a few different ways that could have gone, but clearly he has more information than it seems like he should have, which I don't know. I'm guessing it being connected to Alamancy in some way.
So, okay, that was really my clarifying question here. Is you're guessing it's connected to Allomancy, right?
Yes.
That's your assumption, is it's not previously acquired knowledge, it's active knowledge.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So, without talking about it too much, what do we know about Allomancy so far? We really have 2 skills defined to some degree out of a potential 8 and their implications.
I mean,
there might be more.
2 or 3, depending on
right, 2 or 3, right?
Yeah, because we don't. My assumption and my guess is that the emotional heightening versus depressing is from the same source, and is just 2 different things that you can do with it.
Okay.
No, not necessarily though. Actually, it has to be separate metals, doesn't it? Because otherwise, there would be no way of knowing she enhances his emotions and she depresses his emotions, calms his emotions. And that's proof that she can handle at least 2 different metals. So they have to be separate metals then. That feels shitty. That feels really shitty that those are 2 distinct metals, doesn't it?
No, I don't know that it does. I think that there's more to learn here. But it might feel shitty to some degree.
I feel shitty. Those should be the same metal. I want more powers. I want more different powers.
How would you define those though? Like, so both of those are probably, they're emotional based on your descriptions, right? Like
I feel like one metal should be calming, or like altering emotion should be one.
Okay.
As opposed to heightening emotion and reducing emotion.
Sure.
Like that's a quarter of the metals.
Again, Kelsier does at least clarify once the basic elementic metals. So I'm not gonna not shutting down your idea.
I know,
but
I know.
I'm just also clarifying there are 8 basic metals as far as we know. So
I was just for the long I was thinking about this, and I'm like ready to talk about what I think here, and I'm realizing no, the fact that she can do like both heighten and dampen emotions determines that she can handle 2 metals.
Right. The question still exists though on whether or not it's area of effect, if it's extruded over multiple people. Like there are other questions that exist here yet for how exactly these kind of things function, which I think you did a great job of like discussing the idea of. And there's no firm answer. So
not yet, at least. I'm hoping there will be. I'm guessing.
Fucking love this though. You can tell I'm smiling. This is like a kid on Christmas.
Of course,
we're like in December right now. Like I'm having a great fucking time. Talking about
God, it's December. Shit.
I know, right? Like somehow this entire fucking month snuck up on me. All of Thanksgiving all of November dissolved before my eyes. So
I mean, more than that for me. But weird tangent. We got some snow last night, like a couple inches of snow, as opposed to just a dusting. I have 2 puppies, and neither of them are old enough to have experienced winter yet. Oh. So they fucking loved the snow today.
That's an experience. That's so interesting.
But also
fascinating.
So much snow sticks to their feet that I have to every time I let them back inside, I have to scrape the snow off their feet and not pull too hard because it'll just rip out their hair.
They're golden doodles. Yeah.
One's a poodle, one's a golden doodle. So none of them have neither of them have shedding hairs, shedding fur. So it's hair. So I don't want to rip their hair out. Yeah. So I have to I had a hair dryer. I was heating it up so I could melt it a little bit to scrape it off. It was a mess, but they had all they wanted to do all day so far was be outside. So, that was fun.
So cool. But it's similar, kind of emotionally, this is a depth of experience that happens here. So yeah. Mm-hmm. I love that. We move from the scene of the initial confrontation with Mylev, the new crew leader, Cayman being put out on the street, being made to be a beggar, into one in which Kelsier and Doxson talk about drinking wine, and they're here to converse with Vin specifically. That's a part of this agreement. And they drink ale and wine. That, by our rules, is a drink for us. Anytime anyone else drinks inside of a scene, we take a drink.
I think there is one point earlier, and I mean, it's the lead up to this scene. They're drinking as well. So
yes, I think Cayman is technically drinking because he's at the bar. So I think you're right. We probably owe.
And there's a point where Vin is drinking ale before this point.
Maybe I don't fully remember, but
I think it's also it's the lead up scene before she goes and talks.
Are you recommending we take 3 drinks, PJ?
I'm talking 2. Let's do 2.
That is the sound of me being out of mimosa.
I am finishing my beer at this point now, too. So
I had a whole fucking bottle of champagne on this show. What the fuck is that? Regardless, ale and wine. That's a drink for us, as I said. Cheers, by the way. We had 2, you said, right?
I already took mine and finished my beer, so.
Nice. I finished the last of the mimosa here, too. So
good.
So I do find this sort of interesting, and this is kind of an interesting thing to bring up here. Brandon Sanderson is a member of the Mormon Church, a member of the Latter-day Saints, and he, interestingly enough, was roommates in college with Jeopardy star Ken Jennings, the #1 most winningest Jeopardy star of all time, right? The guy who is currently the 70-30 host of the show in post of all the changes that have happened over the last year, losing But pretty famously, in his, I think, second or third episode, he got all of the questions related to alcohol wrong. And the next day when he came back, he still won despite all the questions on alcohol. He had memorized a list of mixed drinks, alcohol, composition of beverages. He had gone through and kind of like learned all this shit, despite being a member of the Latter-day Saints, and like got all of the questions right going forward. And when he was done, this is a story from Brandon Sanderson, he was done, the elders of the LDS took him aside and said something along the lines of, "Do you have something to tell us, Mr. Jennings?"
That's hilarious.
Yeah, which is, I think it's fantastic. I think it's wonderful. I think it's an interesting little kind of fun anecdote. But I do, it is interesting, of course, and it's a writer's experience to try to write about something that they don't understand and try to make it make sense to other people. So I think he doesn't fully understand, but like gets enough. And like, you know, you're trying to interpret the difference. I'm not saying he's misrepresenting it or anything like that, but
I mean,
sometimes you gotta make shit up.
I'm going to go ahead and defend him a little bit here and not even say that he's not, at this point at least, as far as I can tell, making anything up, because he's not writing from the perspective of somebody that's drunk. He is writing from the perspective of somebody interacting with somebody that's drunk.
Yeah, totally.
Which is completely conceivable that he's experienced. Like, it's almost inconceivable that he's never experienced that. So I'm inclined to believe that he is still not writing about anything that he doesn't explicitly have experience in, because he's not trying to pretend that he knows what it means to be drunk.
Yeah, I think I'm also trying to make a statement about all the alcohol in the series all at once here, to some degree. You know, like, regardless of the circumstance at the moment, like, Brandon doesn't have experience with alcohol, and that's okay. It's absolutely fine.
We don't know that for sure. We know that from an upstanding Latter-day Saints citizen here, that
which Brandon is the upstanding Latter-day Saints. Yeah.
Publicly, and like,
yeah, in these interviews, it is very much a conviction. The interview that I'm citing is actually from a similarly named podcast. So from a podcast that happened back in 2012, PJ, July of 2012. We were just out of high school. Literate Liquors interviewed Brandon Sanderson, and John Hartness, the host. This is where the story comes from, for the most part, is from that show. And yeah, they kind of go through a lot of the beats and talk about the Ken Jennings thing and everything else that kind of comes from that. But this is what gives me that kind of note of, you know, not understanding fully what it means. Yeah. So
yeah, that totally makes sense. Either way, I don't think it changes, like, regardless of his personal view on things, I don't think it changes general understanding of what alcohol does to people. And I don't think alcohol is such a unique, like, experience that if somebody doesn't have experience with it, like, if somebody has ever interacted with somebody that's drunk, you're going to have a pretty good
inclination.
Yeah. Way of understanding what a drunk person feels like and thinks.
Yeah.
Like, you kind of wear your emotions on your sleeve at that point.
Right. And I definitely, I enjoy that about kind of this show as it's discussed, and kind of the other things that go around inside of that podcast. They do a good job talking about things. They actually end up talking about the entire series of books, so you can't read it. But we also get a couple of answers here to questions in kind of our back and forth. Doxson is confirmed based on inferative kind of knowledge, not to be a Misting, could be a Mistborn potentially, but neither is Kelsier. Kelsier is a Mistborn, as we understand him to have used different metals here. He's a half-breed Ska, nobleman in kind of that way, half-breed just like Vin is. And if we're performing a quick test with 2 metal vials, we discover that she too is a very rare Mistborn, someone who's able to use all 8 basic elementic metals.
Does she take 2? I thought it was just 1.
So there are 2 metals in the vial.
Oh, it's 2 metals in a single vial. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
So it's one vial that she downs, but there are 2 different metals.
Gotcha.
And Kelsier might have assumed that if she drank them, because the one that they knew, they knew one of the metals, because she was able to exert that thing, the luck, as she says it. She was able to do that, so they added an extra one to see if she could do both.
Yeah. But like I mentioned before, this is like the point of being curious about Doxson and what he is, because it is very explicitly not mentioned what he is, as far as I remember. Like it is. All we know is he's not a Mystic.
Yep.
But we don't know if he's a Mistborn or mundane. I'm using mundane as if that's like the term for people that are not in tune with.
It's reasonable. So
like, I'm sure. Actually, I'm not sure, but I would assume that there's a term that will come up later that refers to that sort of subset of people, the general populace that are not I guess affected with this ability.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know that at this point. So I'm going to use mundane.
Sure.
Because it makes sense to me. So sorry if that is not the right term, and I'll correct myself when that term comes about. Anyway, I'm genuinely thinking that there is something more to him, and it doesn't have anything to do with allomancy, and is some sort of something else.
I am so excited to look at this further in future episodes.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Raffo, as fans might say. But
Raffo?
Yeah. Raffo. Read and find out.
You said that with such conviction as if I understood.
Well, it's a Robert Jordan thing attached to Brandon Sanderson, because
I don't know who Robert Jordan is.
Robert Jordan wrote The Wheel of Time. He died before he finished it.
Well,
Brandon Sanderson finished The Wheel of Time. There's your like backstory.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's where Raffo comes from. Is like it was the answer in interviews, right? So when you're like asked like, what does this mean? It's like, fucking read and find out, dude. Like, leave me alone. When the book comes out, you'll know. Like, you'll get it.
Right.
So yeah. Vin also here, though, reveals something very important. She reveals that her father is a high prelin in the Steel Ministry, and that she's aware of this, and that her mother had tried to kill her once, with Reen intervening and saving her life. This is all fueling further trauma for our poor girl being without...
Poor girl.
Our poor girl. And, yeah, I mean, it just propels the further trauma, right, that this girl has experienced. It's awful. It's awful.
So we do get the name Steel.
And Gru. His name is Gru. All right, there we are. Gru
Okay.
says Gorl. That's why I default to Gorl all the time. Anyway.
Gotcha.
Despicable me. We're done. All right, continue.
We do find out about this. We found out a little bit because of this story about the Steel Ministry. We know that's where her father is from. We know that that's ironic, or that it's mentioned that that's ironic that that's where he's from. Presumably, that means that beyond the Steel Inquisitors, which it makes sense now that they're a part of the Steel Ministry, they are tasked with hunting down Mistings, essentially, Mistborns, and anybody who is able to utilize allomancy. Like, they are in tune with the use of allomancy. And presumably that comes from the Steel Ministry, which means the Steel Ministry, I'm guessing, is kind of the governing body on the use of allomancy and who is allowed to use it and who is not. So it makes sense that that's an irony in that her father is a high-ranking official within that structure. I just found that super cool. And
yeah, it's especially given what we know about Vin, right? Like, she's been suffering this whole time, and yet her father is a high nobility member, and that sucks for Vin.
What we don't know, though, we don't know if her father knows that.
True. Yeah.
We don't know if her father knows about her existence. We just know that he we know her mother was prostituting herself, essentially.
Yeah, because she had to, right? That's the explanation that's given. Yep.
So, like, it is entirely conceivable, and frankly pretty believable that her father doesn't have any knowledge of her existence. So, maybe he knows that it's a possibility that he has a child to any number of whores that he has bedded in the past, but he doesn't necessarily know about her or specifically who she was birthed from. Nothing solid there, which is interesting. It's
a tough discernible point for her because there is no real origin for Vin outside of this traumatic moment with her mom that she remembers, right? She knows that her dad is kind of this foreign object to some degree because he's a part of the Steel Ministry, and her mom was this whore, as it's also explained inside the novel, but a sex worker nonetheless, and she is a product of that relationship. And it's strange because our understanding as well of those relationships is that after that happens with the noblemen, the Ska are killed. The Ska women are murdered before a child could be born. Yeah. So to prevent a la the Lord Ruler half-breeds.
So a couple things here. First of all, I have to apologize immediately because I channeled my inner Frank Reynolds and said whore.
Oh no, I got it. I totally understood what you're going for.
I just didn't want to make it sound like I was making a joke of the situation. It's obviously a very heavy situation that this backstory lends itself to. 2, we know that Vin was very nearly killed by her mother, and my assumption here, based on this knowledge and thinking about it more and more, my thought is her father found out about it and was pressuring her mother to kill her in order to save herself in that sense. There's pressure coming from somewhere to kill her, because otherwise why would it exist? People are fucking crazy. I get that. Some parents are fucking insane and kill their children. It's horrifying, but it happens. And maybe she's found herself in that situation where her mother is a absolutely total psychopath that wants to kill her child and get saved by her brother. But I'm more inclined to believe. Yeah. I'm more inclined to believe that she is being pressured by somebody higher up, presumably her father or somebody who works for her father, to get rid of her in order for there not to be problems going forward. But who knows? This is all total speculation at this point.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just had to apologize for the whore thing because I definitely said that in a comical way.
I understood the Always Sunny reference for sure. I got it.
That doesn't make it okay to joke about. I feel like saying it whore makes it more of a joke and less of a derogatory term, but maybe that's just doubly worse, and I'm not sure, so I figured
I actually think it makes it more of a derogatory term because it assumes that it's a low profession, and that's its own issue. So yeah. I feel you.
It's whatever, man. Either way, I'm sorry for making a joke out of it.
Yeah, apology accepted. So the final note of this week, our 5th and final entry, is one in the journal. It's speaking about the journey ahead of our unnamed hero of ages. He was looking to hire some terrorist packmen as they're used to the cold that we will be headed into.
So this is a point this is the first journal entry where it doesn't feel like it's just world building and building on what we believe this hero to be and understanding the gravity of the situation, anything like that. And my assumption now is that these terrorist packmen are going to come into the story or something to that effect. I'm assuming, and maybe it's naive for me to think this way, but I'm assuming that these journal entries are going to go forward and become more relevant and directly relevant to the passage we're about to read in the story.
Okay.
And I hope that's the case because I think it's fun for us in the way that we have set up our show for that to be a point of foreshadowing and for me to know this information before going into this chapter, these chapters. I don't know. I'm excited.
Cool. To me, that sounds like a good thought on where these these narrative kind of journal entries go. And I don't have a whole lot to add there because naturally these are narrative journal entries and it's kind of meant to be left up to interpretation. So I don't want to comment too far and kind of let you swim in your own filth, as it were. So
well, gross.
With that, we are done with this episode, buddy. We made it through the reading. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about so much. We dug through a lot of. Go ahead.
This is the point where we would usually go into PJ's predictions, where Cross will ask me a question of what I think will happen. But this being the first episode, we don't really have a whole lot to go on. But if anybody, I think we briefly mentioned this at the beginning of the episode. If anybody has anything, like any questions for like me, if you have anything for me to like guess what my predictions are, send them in to either our social media or our email, all of which, by the way, can be found in our show notes. And Crossland will parse through those and figure out when is most appropriate to ask those of me. And we will feature them on the show because super fun part of the end of each episode. But we don't have anything for tonight. Similarly, we don't have any question of the week yet for a variety of reasons. One, it's been a while since we published an episode and we didn't ask that on like, and by publish an episode, I mean like a major format, like the way that we do our normal episodes. It's been a month or more. So we don't have a question of the week from last month or last week. And we don't really have a way of, because of the way we're recording this, we don't have a way of getting answers before we record our next episode. So, this is where that will live. End of the episode, question of the week, completely tangentially related to the story, but not necessarily directly related. For example, we've asked, like, what's your favorite escape moment in any sort of story? Stuff like that. That will live here, but that I think we're going to start in episode 4, if I remember correctly. Like, that's sort of our plan.
Yes, because of the nature of the holiday seasons, we actually have to condense our recording schedule here. Our reading and recording schedules. So come the beginning of part 2, we will begin to ask our questions of the week, per PJ's point.
Right. But more rambling on my end. So
no, I mean you hit it on the head. Again, send us in any of those thoughts. Make sure that if you want to answer the question of the week as well, I put it on Instagram, I put it on Twitter. Feel free to message us, follow us, check us out there. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have to talk about what we're going to be reading next week. So next week is going to be chapter 4 through 6. It's roughly the same amount of chunk. If you're inside of the same chunk amount, it's chapter 4 through 6. It's going to be A-okay. It's another 60 pages in the paperback, roughly 50-ish, I think, in the hardcover. So we're going to be tackling that chunk of the story here on the show. That's going to be the plan. Remember, when you read these, you want to make sure that you read the chapter. So if we're going through chapter 6, that means you're going to read the chapter 7 intro if you're looking at the book. If you're in the audiobook, you'll know that you're reading the intro ahead of time. So
we, I think, both have the same box set of paperbacks, I believe. Yes. So I don't know if all paperbacks are the same, but for our copy, it is page 61 through 126. That is what we're reading.
Yes. And again, you can always find our schedule for the chapters and related things at wordsandwhiskey.show/schedule. So you can always check that out there. Beyond that, that's where we'll leave you for the week.
Thank you once again, and as always, to Tim and Andrew. They make this show exist. Tim does all of our back-end things and is just fucking amazing at, like, all things software. And Andrew makes us actually sound presentable and does all of our mastering and like audio work. And we are so incredibly lucky to have both of them working for us. So thank you both as always. You can check out our show notes, as Crossland mentioned before. You'll find our schedule, our Patreon, our previous episodes, websites, social medias, all in one convenient spot.
Yeah, it's all available within our show notes. Again, our Patreon is available at patreon.com/words and whiskey. Our Instagram and Twitter are Words Whiskey Show, and our email is wordsandwhiskeyshow@gmail.com. Yeah, so that's kind of the game plan for the most part. Beyond that, please leave us and any other podcast you listen to a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It is so important, strangely, to the way that we do on every other platform. Regardless, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or any other medium, it takes a couple seconds to create a profile. It helps every podcast that you listen to. Highly recommend doing that. For whatever reason, Apple is still the stranglehold on metrics. So here we are. Now we're here. Beyond that, we're so excited for our new patron to have joined us this week. Give a shout out to Barback Lex M. Thanks a million for supporting the show, friend. And can't wait to talk to you all next week. Thank you so much.
Goodbye, everybody. We will see you at the next one.